I am recording. And so my very first question for you is basically, what does your center do and what is your mission?
Sure. So our center was one of the first centers that was started at Texas Tech way back in 1965. And we live in a very water scarce region, as you know, and then we depend on the Ogallala Aquifer for our water needs, which is used for irrigation, municipal, and other water sources. We essentially don't have any other reliable water sources. So the center was started with a mission to preserve and protect, and as well as augment water supplies, make water use more efficient, and study about water, both in the region, and this region serves as a great test bed for other similar areas in the world. So, over years, we have had the opportunity to take what we've learned here and then expand it to other places as well. And as the center grew, we started looking at other problems like contamination, groundwater contamination, how does groundwater interact with climate and other things. So our center right now does all things water, basically, looking at water conservation, water augmentation technologies like desalination. We look at other strategies to manage water, to allocate water, and essentially study how water resources are going to change over time and what's the best way to manage that water.
Perfect, thank you. My next question is, how did you become a center director?
So I came to Texas Tech in 2012, and before that, I spent 11 years at Texas A&M Kingsville, and I was the director of National Science Foundation funded center there, looking at environmental sustainability of coastal areas, particularly along the U.S.-Mexico border. So the dean was trying to move the center to a larger, so this was right around the time when Texas Tech had become a nationally recognized university. There was a lot of push towards tier one, being a tier one school, and so he wanted me to take over the directorship of the center, and then start looking at more federal grants and federal competitive grants and things like that. And there were other centers on campus, even though we were the first water centers, there were other centers that did either water-related work or something very similar to water, like the Climate Science Center looks at climate, which water plays a very big role. Climate plays a very big role in water. The Kastner has a water center that's more focused on agriculture. There was a water center in law school. We had ICASALS, which is a well-known center on semi-arid lands, land studies. So one of their missions was that the dean wanted me to essentially work closely with all these centers and go after large integrated proposals, that are helpful to the region, but also helps us be competitive through federal funding and other things. So that's what got me into taking on the directorship of the center.
Okay, my next question is, in your opinion, is there a preferred path to becoming a center director?
Yes, so centers do differ. So some centers are very specific. They do one thing, they produce one, there's a nanophotonics center in our college, which does, a very specialized aspect of one aspect. Water centers tend to be more broad because water problems are more diverse. So if you're interested in being a center director, you need to have ability to be part of large grants, managing people, trying to connect different types of ideas and bring them together. So essentially, you need to be a synthesis type person or a synthesizer who can bring various ideas and dimensions to look at look at a problem very holistically. And of course, doing that would also mean that you are dealing with people of various different personalities. You're dealing with various types of financial arrangements. So you need to have some interest and understanding of the procedures and policies, and what can be done within the policies of tech, the state, and the federal grants. So that interest in administration, coupled with ability to bring people together and do something that's greater than their individual contributions, is essential for being a center director.
Okay, my next question is, how do you know when you're doing something well as far as your center is concerned, and working with all of the different centers and people and personalities that you have to at a large university?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm gonna, so as I said, one of the big mission of our center is to um, go after large federal funding, or federal grants. And of course those are very competitive, and they take multiple attempts sometimes, to get those. And so one of the markers that we look at, there are several markers that we look at. One in terms of how much funding do we generate, how much publications and scholarly output do we put out, how much of that is related to outreach to the community. And the community is not just West Texas, but the professional community, like organizing conferences at national level, serving as editors and editorial boards, and then serving on proposal panels, because that's usually a good way to know what's happening. And then of course, a big part of it is also working with other centers and trying to find projects that are cross-disciplinary. So we have ongoing projects with, say, Climate Science Center. We have ongoing projects with Kastner Center, and then we have ongoing projects with TIE. Some of our researchers work very closely with the Toxicology Institute, and of course other departments in engineering. So we usually look at multiple levels of evaluation, seeing, what are we doing as a center in terms of our research output, as measured using funding, as measured using publications, as measured using the proposals that we have written, the people that we have brought together, and then how well we have worked with other similar centers, or complementary centers on campus, in going after large multidisciplinary grants. So those are all our evaluation metrics, and then we look at them to see how we're doing each year, and then set goals for next year, and then continue to work in that direction.
Okay, great. Now my next question for you is, how do you integrate into the larger organization that your center is a part of?
Sure. So the center, as I said, we are housed in the civil engineering department, but it's a university-wide center. So since we are in the College of Engineering, the center director reports to the dean, but it's a center that's under the VPR's, under the umbrella of the VPR's office. So so we get an opportunity to integrate across multiple scales. We work closely with our departmental colleagues, because civil engineering comprises of a variety of different sub-disciplines, if you may. There are people who do transportation, who might worry about flooding. There are people who do buildings. They may worry about water supply to, these communities. So at that level, we try to work with other centers that are within our department, or with other faculty in our department, who are not necessarily water related, but where water plays a big picture. The same thing with, we like to work with computer scientists, for example, to look at how we can use big data, some of the technologies that they have in machine learning and other new things. How can we use that to explore our data sets, water-related data sets, and get insights into that? We like to work with electrical engineers and chemical engineers to come up with new methods on how to look at contaminants, how to detect contaminants that may be virtually undetectable, but with unless you have very specialized machines, how do you create those methods? We work, the group of our researchers work on technologies like desalination. How do you make the technology more efficient? And then also they work with chemical engineers and mechanical engineers and others. I do a lot of work with Climate Science Center because I'm interested in looking at what is the future climate impacts on groundwater? What does it do to our water resources? And a big issue that comes with is, since we're in a rural area, agriculture-based economy, a lot of it boils down to what happens to our agriculture sector. How can we make it? What can we do in that sector to improve our water use or reduce the water footprint? So we work very closely with folks in Kastner, and we work with Ecosols on several international projects in Oman, in Ethiopia, and other places which are also water scarce and share very similar problems with us. So that's what we like to do. We like to bring that engineering expertise with others. We work with social scientists. We work with folks in media and communications. I served on a PhD committee of one of the media and community. We had a joint research project with people in media and communications, where this PhD student was looking at water news and how do we disseminate water information. Do people look at charts and graphs, or do they like catchy headlines? So he was doing all kinds of very cool experiments on Amazon by creating this fake news websites, if you may, and seeing how people reacted to some of the information or some of the misinformation that could be provided, and then we were looking at how was the water back then? Were they under drought, or did they have a rain? Did it change their perceptions about water? So very cool studies. So that's where a lot of our interest is, in bringing people of very diverse background together, and then start looking at these problems more holistically. So as a center, we work with almost everybody on campus, several other centers on campus, and that's been very rewarding for me. And that's one of our big mission is we understand that as engineers we cannot solve this problem unless we have the community involved with us, and then unless we have the other aspects of water are looked at, like the economics of water, there are social justice issues associated with water, so how do we integrate those things into decision making? Because the decision makers are not just going to say this is a good technology, or we're going to put it in. It might cost too much money, or they may not get, they may not know about the technology, and people might say, well, I don't want to do this, right? For example, we have Big Springs, which actually went and reuses its wastewater, so we call it the reclaimed water, where they essentially take the water that comes out of the toilets, if you may, or when we shower, and they treat that water and make it more cleaner than what's in the reservoir, and then put it back into the reservoir, clean it again, and then supply it to people. And they're not the only ones, other San Diego and other people do it too. And it happens naturally as well. When water runs, the next neighbor spigot, I jokingly tell in my class, either you drink your own wastewater or somebody else's wastewater. So that's your choice, but that's a big yuck factor. I mean, we have the technology to clean it, but a lot of people will say, well, I don't want to drink that water because it's just, I don't feel good about it, right? But that water can be 3 or 4 times more cleaner than some of the other water that's naturally available in some of these reservoirs. But that's an uphill battle, and that can only happen if there is good communication. And the Big Springs was able to do it, but the city of Brownwood, which is right next to it, just couldn't get an ordinance passed because people were up in arms. They just didn't want, they knew the technology worked in the next town, but they were not ready to do it. So we kind of understand the various dimensions of that water, and why that's important to solve problems holistically. So we are always looking for opportunities to work with other groups. We work with social scientists who are looking at how does aging, of population change their water use preferences, and are they adapting to new technologies, or how willing are they to adopt this new technologies? And then we work with economists who say, well, what does it cost? How much are people willing to pay for this water? And I want, you think you have a cool technology, does it really, can somebody afford it? And so things like that. And then we interface with, the High Plains Groundwater District, the city of Lubbock, the city of Wolford, some of our neighboring communities, which give us great test beds to test out some of these ideas and see what they're doing, and then, bring and try to give a social context to the type of research we want to do. So yeah, very integrative. We work with other professional organizations. We serve as editorial board members and other things. So, we are keeping with the latest and greatest that's happening, in other parts of the country. We interface with A&M and UT, water centers at A&M, UT, and other schools, so that we can look at statewide problems holistically. So it's all, for me, the biggest thing we do is collaborate. That's what we like to do, and then try to solve problems and look at those problems in a holistic way and try to find solutions that work, as opposed to being, hey, this is really cool engineering, but it's just not cost effective, or people may not like it, or there are other reasons that we have to look at.
This is an extra question, but do you ever travel abroad as part of your job?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the last 2 years we've had a project in Ethiopia, and we were trying to build a PhD program in Ethiopia. What happened in Ethiopia was giving money to students to go abroad and study PhD, and then come back. And what they realized was that most of the Ethiopians who came to US didn't want to go back. And even if they went back, they were very frustrated because they learned something that just was not applicable in their country. And so they would be finding ways to get out again. And then a lot of those PhDs, to retain them and give them more money, they were made like presidents of university, or they were made provosts, and so they were given these administrative positions, and they're like, no, I want to do research, and I don't want to be stuck doing administrative work. So it was a very frustrating experience for the country to say, hey, we've spent this money and we're not getting back what we really want, which is solve our problems. And so they kind of wanted a flip model, and they said, so the Germans gave some money and said, what you really need to be doing is find a university that will come down to Ethiopia and start a PhD program and train your faculty to have students, and then create new students, start looking at problems in Ethiopia. So we got that grant. So I was in charge of the water portion of that, for that grant, and then of course there was transportation, civil, we had a grant through the civil program. And so I had graduated 3 students who did various things in Ethiopia. And then I've been to Oman. Oman has really ancient water systems called aflat systems, and this is somebody actually goes under, they find a spring where there is water, and then they actually go and dig a tunnel under the spring, so that this is a set group of people, and it's done it is generational, so that there's a certain tribe that actually does it. And then they go underground, and then they're essentially digging a tunnel, and then they move that water to a place where they can do irrigation and stuff. So this was a project through ICASALS and us, and it was very fascinating to just look at that. And then the year I went, a couple of years ago, it had never rained for one full year in Oman. They had no rain. And, so they were like, how do we get water? So they wanted to treat water. In some of the big cities, they could take the seawater and then desalinate it. And then, of course, the oil prices went down. So that kind of caused them some economic hardships. And then they're like, how do we get water to the villages? we can't go and move that seawater uphill into a village. So there were a lot of issues that were involved. So I'm still involved in some of that work. I do a lot of work in India. I've got collaborations in India, so I occasionally go to India. The government of India had a couple of programs where they wanted me to go and give them talks on various issues, groundwater issues and stuff. So I've been to India several times on that, and then I was in China, looking at some of the problems, growing population in China. So last year I was actually on every continent except Australia, and then I was jokingly, I told my wife, we should make a short trip to Australia and come back, and then I would have been on all continents where humans live. And then we have collaborations in Brazil. I actually taught a class in Brazil, about water, and this was right where Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil kind of come together, and they have one of the largest dams that they've built. It's actually the second largest dam now, after the Three Gorges Dam in China, but this still produces the most amount of electricity, and it's all shared between Paraguay and Brazil. And we took students there, and this was just fascinating experience for them. And then it's got this really nice waterfalls, and they took us in a boat and took us underneath the waterfalls. I mean, that would have never happened in the U.S. I mean, because of security and safety and all that stuff. And then the kids were so excited, and the person who was driving the boat was so excited because everybody was getting excited. They're like, okay, I'll take you in a second, So he made another extra trip and took us back behind the waterfall so we could see it. And it was things you can do in other places that you can't do in the U.S. And so it was really fascinating experiences. So yeah, I mean, we do quite a bit of international work, and again, West Texas is a great place because it's a perfect test bed. We grow food, we have people, we don't have water, we have a lot of wind, and how can we tap into all of this and sustain economies like this? Of course, if we can, similar problems you will see in Oman, you will see in India, you will see in China, you will see in Australia. So what we do here is applicable in other places as well. And then there are similar problems, like there are arsenic problems here in West Texas, and then there are huge arsenic problem in India. So we kind of look at a lot of similarities. What can we do versus what they can do, and that gets very interesting. Not just on technical dimensions, but also on the social dimensions, and looking at larger scale water issues, which are always interesting. So yeah, we love to collaborate. We love to work with people, and then of course, we work quite a bit with the ICASOLs and other groups that are more plugged into some of those international programs, which is part of their mission. So we dovetail with them on projects like this.
Okay, my next question for you is, what is the most valuable piece of advice you could offer to a prospective center director when it comes to handling conflicts within maybe your department, center departments, or within the larger institution?
Right. And I think, having very clear objectives and keeping things very transparent are really the two very key issues when it comes to handling center type projects, because there are conflicts that come in because we do get some money from states. Sometimes the dean comes and says, like, oh, well, I have some money. What type of equipment do you want to buy? Or like, I need to spend it now. What can you do? When we get things like that, it's very important to be transparent, and then have a plan for it, rather than try to do something very quickly, which always leads to people thinking, well, why did he buy this versus my needs versus other needs. So having that communication, or saying these are our priorities, this is how we're going to proceed, is very important. A lot of times you also get conflicts when you're putting very large proposals, and then you have multiple people on that proposal, who gets what credit, how much credit should they get. Those all become very important, especially we want to make sure that when we bring in young investigators or new faculty, they don't feel like, we are giving all the ideas, we're doing the work, but we're not getting the credit, because a lot of times, some of these large grants, you want people who are experienced to lead that grant and then, be research leaders, but at the same time, you want to show these younger people who have ideas, who are new coming in, who want to try things. So making sure that, if we make decisions, strategic decisions on who gets to lead it or who doesn't, at least internally we are giving the right credit, and making up and saying like, hey, I may not give you a full month salary, but I will send you for a conference or two, which in the long run is much more useful for you, because you will make connections, and your name will be out there when you go for tenure. You have people will know you, and then like write letters for you. And so it's kind of like balancing those things are very important, like, and then clear lines of communications are very important. And for me, it's like part of being a center director is trying to help others, like, so if you especially if you're running these large projects, I tend to take the least amount of credit and then try to give it to others, so that there is no conflict coming in saying, well, he's just taking all the credit, why would I, and of course that doesn't work in the long run, because you can fool people once that way, but they're not gonna continue to work with you. So there are challenges to collaborations, but nothing that cannot be surmounted by open communications, being very transparent, and then making some of these hard choices very explicit upfront, saying, well, this is what we learned from our last go around. How can we improve it? What can I do to make it better? Especially the students in engineering get paid at one level. Like, we usually pay our engineering students a lot more than, say, what they get paid in social sciences or in other things. And a lot of times they have this dual TA-RA model, where they want the student to be a TA because they have a very large number of classes, and they want their best students to be TAs for a certain amount of time, but they also want them to be researchers for a certain amount of time. In engineering, we tend to box them into like, you're a TA or an RA, and that creates like, difficulties in terms of budget. So, and then a lot of times I tell them, like, if the budget looks lopsided, that's the first way NSF or some of the funding agencies will come and say, well, you're just putting these people's name just because you want to look like you're doing multidisciplinary research, but you're really not putting money where your mouth is, like, where your pen is. So that type of conversations are very important to make sure that we are being equitable when we put these types of proposals, and that takes a little bit of back and forth and conversations, and very explicit and honest conversations, as opposed to again, the goal should be, we want to win this proposal, like, who gets the credit comes next, and then it should be proportional to the amount of work that's being done, and then look at both the tangibles and the intangibles to say, hey, this is what we can offer you, to be on this proposal, and then make sure that it's fair among different people. So those are obviously some of the challenges, but that's why it's important to start proposals early, and build a team, build the dynamics, and especially if you're working on multi-institutional proposals, it adds another layer of complexity in terms of, UT obviously versus A&M, the schools are bigger, they have different resources, and, how do you balance among them, and, how do you make sure it's equitable? Those issues really have to be, worked out, and they'll be worked out through some very honest conversations. And again, it's not just saying I want to do this because I said so, but trying to back it up with, let's look at what makes this proposal competitive, and then let's work with that goal. Make that the focus of our effort is very important, and keeping your eye on that. is what takes time and takes creativity. And but it's been very fortunate. One thing I'll tell about Texas Tech is uh, all the water centers, and then the researchers who work with us, they're extremely great people. I mean, we're really blessed with some of the finest researchers. We're not just great researchers, but great people. So I've never, most of the times the conversations has been, yeah, I want to help the young faculty. They're all like, yes, 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 that's what we need to do, and then it's done. So and similarly, we have established really good relationships with UT, A&M, and other centers. So again, if we say this is what we want to do, this is what our dean wants, what do you guys think? And then either they'll give me very good suggestions to say, hey, maybe you should take this to the dean and see what he thinks, or yeah, we can work this way around, or we can do something, so we've been very fortunate that way. And I think a lot of that has to do with just being very transparent, very open, and having good lines of communication early on, rather than come in the last minute and try to do some things that never works.
Great, thank you for that. My last question for you is, do you have any additional advice for anyone who might be interested in becoming a center director?
Oh, that's a good question. So I guess you're asking in my center, or
in any center. You work with a lot of directors.
Any additional advice?
A lot of places.
So somebody who is not a director who wants to be a center director, is that, I'm sorry, yeah, okay. Yeah, I think, like a lot of times when students get their PhDs, they tend to be very narrow. I mean, I do this to my PhD students too, so I'm guilty as charged. So we like PhD students to focus on one problem and get into the depths of that problem. But it's also important as a center director to have some width, breadth of knowledge. So that's a very key aspect, because as a center director, you're not only doing your research, but you're trying to find other researchers to do other, who are trying to do other things, and trying to help them with resources, and trying to help them establish their research, and then sometimes mentor them to say, maybe you should look at this problem, or and then if somebody comes and talks to me and says, I want this problem solved, and then I can say, well, I know the right person who actually does this, right? So knowing what others do and having an appreciation for their research in addition to your research is extremely critical. That I think is a very necessary qualification to be a center director, especially for a multidisciplinary center like water centers, which tend to be very broad, because water problems can be social problems, they can be engineering problems, they can be technical problems, they can be people's problems, but eventually I say all water problems are people's problems at the end of the day, because we all like to drink water and we need to drink water. So that's I think key, is to see that breadth along with your depth, so you have to kind of balance that. And then the second thing is to have respect for administrative protocols and policies, and having an understanding of how that system works, what can be done within the parameters of a grant, what cannot be done within the parameters of the grant, and especially not all money is the same. There are certain things you can do with certain grants, you cannot do certain things with certain grants, and you can't mix federal grants, for example, to do the same project. So those are some of the things that are, you have to be very familiar with. And we're very fortunate at Tech, because we've got really good people in our research administration side who are very knowledgeable of these things. But if you're in smaller schools, for example, or other schools, if you're in very small schools, you usually don't have the resources, and you have to do a lot of things on your own. And if you're in a very large school, there is usually the risk that something might slip through the cracks, because there is so many things going on, and then something just slides through, and can become a very big issue, because eventually the PIs and the center directors are responsible for, all the research that they do and the money they spend, and it needs to be spent wisely. So so those kinds of things, you should have a healthy appreciation for that. And rather than saying, oh, somebody's going to deal with it, you need to have some understanding of that. So that's again, a lot of young faculty uh, try not to get into those minutiae or details because it takes away from research, or takes away from what they like to do. But having a good appreciation of that, and I've been very fortunate because my advisor taught me some of these things when I was a PhD student. She would let me manage grants. She would let me talk to the sponsored research and say, hey, can I do this? Can I move money from this to this? She would say, why don't you go and talk? So that I got some experience of what it was, and which was very, very fortunate because when I interviewed for my first job, I had the director of the sponsored research who was one on the committee, and so I was asking her all these questions about what's the indirect rate, what is this, how do you guys do this, and she was like, you're the first person who's asked me, because a lot of times I have to tell people, what do we do? Why do you have to run it through us and all that stuff? And, there are some really good programs that our grad school runs on some of these things that I encourage my TAs, my students to go and talk. And then, again, because I learned from my advisor, I try to impart that to my students. And also a lot of young faculty saying, hey, just because you got a grant doesn't mean you can do this. You have promised to do something, so you got to do that, and you just can't move money and do things unless you get permission from. A lot of times you will get it, but you still have to ask and have a formal documentation. It's not enough that you pick up the phone and the guy said, yeah, it's okay, and then because tomorrow the program officer may be gone, the new person might say, I don't see a documentation, who approved it. So things like that, they need some training and guidance, and then so those are some of the things that you should be have an interest in if you want to be a center director. And a lot of times that's not formally taught in many places. So if there are places, if there are seminars and things like that that tech does, other schools do that too. It's a good idea to get into that and then get some experience early on. So you at least you can tell to yourself, do I like this, or maybe center directorship is not for me because I don't want to deal with this types of administrative things. That's a good outcome as well. Like at least you'll then focus and say, this is what I really love to do and this is what I'm going to do, and you can be great at it. So but those are two things that are not very traditional of academics. We like to be very deep in what we do. We take a topic and then we want to become experts at it. And then we usually don't like to handle administrative stuff because that means it's taking away from time to do what we really want to do, right? And as a center director, that's your job, is to help faculty take away some of that while you're teaching them, but at the same time take away some of that and say, don't worry about this. So we have a support staff, and we have an admin assistant who keeps track of our accounts, and then so sometimes they don't get updated on Cayuse or on the system, and so we keep track of shadow books, and then we say, okay, because it takes about 2-3 months sometimes for that money to hit, and then the PI might go and say, oh, I have all this money, I want to spend it, and then they've overspent, and then and so we want to avoid some of these. So we make sure our admin person gives them accounts every month and say, this is what you have, this is where you want to spend it. Sometimes when the project is ending, we want to tell them, hey, start spending, because they won't let you spend in the last month. And so things like that. And so there are the post award process that I have help, but it's also important that I oversee, because if a project goes bad in a set, I have to, it's on me, so that's important to kind of have an healthy interest in it. I mean, you don't have to be an expert, but you should at least be knowledgeable to go talk to people and understand what are the parameters of the grant, what can be done, and that interest has to be there. Otherwise, it's very difficult to be in a position as a center director. And then knowing opportunities, looking for opportunities is very important. And that means you need to have a broad mind and open mind to say, oh, yeah, that's a cool idea. It may not be my research, but there's someone I know who can do this. And now I can bring this person and this person together, and they can probably write something, so that's very important as well. Like, to think beyond your own research and think about opportunities that might come from fruitful collaborations, which maybe in two complete ends of the campus, so or even with somebody outside the campus. So that's important as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Is there anything additional that you'd like to add that maybe I didn't ask?
I think you pretty much covered everything in terms of, like, the role of the center, the role of the center director, what are some of the conflict, how do you handle conflicts, and those types of things. And I think resources are always a challenge for centers, like so we have small amount of money that we get through the state as a special item, and that's always a challenge because we don't know whether that will stay or not. And so those are unlike other academic units where you have students and then the student fee gets you, it's a fee generated model in many academic departments. Centers are like more funding related, so we write proposals, we write grants, and a lot of our funding is generated that way. So it's a little bit different in the sense that, your money will fluctuate over time, right? Like, because some years you'll get a lot of proposals, some years you may not get that many. So balancing that over the long run is also a very important task. And, that's what makes center directorship a little different from an academic unit, where you have a degree, you're giving degree to somebody, and there are a certain number of students who come in, so we can kind of project and say, well, we're going to get so many students, and that generates so much revenue. So it's not that direct, it's not that straightforward because it fluctuates quite a bit. So one has to find ways to kind of smooth that out, and then make sure that, one, we're not getting overwhelmed with projects, which is not good, or at the same time, we don't have any projects, so trying to maintain that healthy balance. And then if we see growth areas, we go and talk and say, hey, we need more resources because this is what's happening. And then finding ways to share our resources, or collaborate with others and trying to get some of the instruments or things like that, is also another big important issue. So it's a very collaborative environment. And if you like collaborations, if you like breadth and a wide range of projects, it's a very rewarding career to have. It's a very interesting career to have, because you get to see not only do your research but also help others do research, which is always cool.
Well, thank you very much for your insight. I do appreciate it. And I'm going to stop the recording now.
Sure. All right. Informative.
Start it again here.